In a quiet corner of Missouri, nestled between farmlands and winding country roads, sits a bar with an unassuming name, the Golden Lantern. From the outside, it looks like any other roadside tavern. Its wooden facade has seen decades of wear, and a faded neon sign flickers in the window, advertising cheap beer and a good time. To the locals, it's a gathering place, somewhere to swap stories, drown sorrows, or share a laugh over a cold drink. But to those who've spent enough time there, the Golden Lantern is more than just a bar. It's a place with secrets that some say are best left undisturbed. It all started with a man named Tim. Tim was the kind of bartender everyone liked, always quick with a joke, a story, or a strong pour. He'd been behind the counter for over 20 years, practically a fixture of the place. But one rainy November night, something changed. Tim disappeared. Just like that. No goodbye. No explanation. The last anyone saw of him was when he locked the door after closing, just as he'd done every night before. When the bar reopened the next day, Tim was gone, and in his place, something else remained. The townsfolk didn't think much of it at first. People leave jobs, even after decades. Maybe Tim had had enough of the late nights and rowdy patrons. Maybe he'd moved on to something better. But as the days turned into weeks, questions began to surface. His truck was still parked behind the bar, exactly where it had been that rainy November night. His small apartment above the bar was untouched, keys on the counter, clothes still in the drawers, and a half-finished crossword puzzle lying on the coffee table. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The police were called, of course. They combed through his apartment and the bar, questioning anyone who might have seen something. But there were no leads, no signs of foul play, just an empty space where Tim used to be. Eventually, the investigation was closed, marked as a voluntary disappearance. But those who knew Tim best refused to believe it. He wasn't the kind of man to walk away from the life he'd built. Certainly not without a word. Months passed, and the Golden Lantern continued to operate. A new bartender was hired, the regulars kept coming, and life went on. But something was different. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Drinks left on the counter would slide, ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. The jukebox, notorious for eating quarters and refusing to play, would suddenly come to life, spinning records no one had selected. And then there were the whispers. Quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. One patron, a truck driver named Jack, claimed to have seen Tim's reflection in the bar mirror late one night. He swore Tim was standing behind the counter, cleaning a glass like he always used to. But when Jack turned around, there was no one there. Others brushed it off, blaming it on too much whiskey or a late-night imagination. But the stories kept coming. Then came the night of the storm. A summer thunderstorm had rolled in, fierce and unrelenting, cutting power to half the town. The Golden Lantern was one of the few places still lit, its generator humming in defiance of the darkness. That night, a group of regulars gathered around the bar, laughing and telling stories to pass the time. The rain lashed against the windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder punctuated their conversation. But as midnight approached, the mood began to shift. It started with the lights. They flickered once, twice, then dimmed to a dull glow. The laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. The jukebox, which had been quiet all evening, began to play an old tune, one that no one could remember selecting. It was Tim's favorite song, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to echo off the walls. The air grew heavy, and an icy chill swept through the room, despite the summer heat. And then they heard it, a voice, low and gravelly, coming from the back of the bar. "Close the door. You're letting the cold in." Every head turned toward the source, but the corner booth was empty. One of the regulars, a man named Pete, stood up and shouted, "Tim, is that you?" But there was no answer, just the faint sound of a glass clinking against the counter. When they looked back at the bar, a single drink sat there, a whiskey neat. Tim's drink. One by one, the patrons began to leave, muttering excuses about the weather and early mornings. Pete stayed behind, determined to get to the bottom of it. He walked around the bar, searching every corner, every shadow for a trace of his old friend. But what he found was something he could never explain. In the bar's large mirror, there was a single handprint, smeared as though someone had pressed their palm against the glass. And beneath it, scrawled in condensation, were the words, "I'm still here." Pete couldn't shake what he'd seen that night. The handprint, the drink, the words in the mirror, it all pointed to something he couldn't explain. The next day, he told anyone who would listen, friends, family, even the new bartender, but most just laughed it off. "You've been drinking too much," they'd say. Or, "It was probably just condensation." But Pete knew better. He started spending more time at the Golden Lantern, arriving early and staying late, watching, waiting, searching for any sign that Tim was still there. It didn't take long before Pete began to notice more. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't just random murmurs. They were words. A name. His name. Pete. Pete. He'd spin around, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the bar would be empty. And then there were the shadows, small, fleeting movements in the corner of his eye that always vanished when he turned to look. One night, as Pete sat alone at the bar, he decided to confront whatever, or whoever, it was. He poured himself a drink, raised his glass, and said aloud, "Tim, if you're here, show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the old bar stools. But then, the lights dimmed. The jukebox sprang to life, playing the same haunting melody as before. And there in the mirror, Pete saw him. Tim was standing behind the bar, just as he always had, a towel slung over one shoulder, polishing a glass. He looked the same as Pete remembered, except for his eyes. They were dark, hollow, and staring directly at him. Pete froze, unable to move or speak, as Tim leaned in closer, his reflection pressing against the glass. And then, in a voice that sounded both distant and unervingly close, Tim said, "Why didn't you help me?" Pete stumbled backward, knocking over his chair, and the vision vanished. The bar was empty again, the mirror clear. But Tim's words echoed in his mind. "Why didn't you help me?" What did he mean? Help him with what? Pete became obsessed, diving into the bar's history, digging through old records and newspaper clippings. That's when he discovered the fire. The Golden Lantern had been rebuilt decades ago after a blaze destroyed the original structure. According to the reports, the fire started in the early hours of the morning, trapping several people inside. Among the victims was a young bartender named Timothy Harper. He had been working late that night, closing up after a busy shift. The fire marshal's report suggested it was an accident, a faulty gas line ignited by a cigarette. But as Pete read on, he noticed something strange. Witnesses claimed they heard shouting from inside the bar. Not screams of panic, but angry voices. An argument. And then silence. The deeper Pete dug, the more questions he had. Why had no one tried to save Tim? Why were the details of the fire so vague? And why did the rebuilt Golden Lantern seem to carry the weight of that tragedy? As if the fire had never truly gone out. Determined to find answers, Pete decided to stay in the bar overnight, alone. He brought a flashlight, a notebook, and an old photograph of Tim that he'd found in the archives. The night started uneventfully. Pete sat at the bar, sipping coffee, flipping through his notes, and glancing occasionally at the mirror. Midnight came and went, and still, nothing happened. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted. Pete could see his breath in the air, his hands trembling as he gripped the flashlight. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The bar was plunged into darkness, save for the beam of Pete's flashlight, which now seemed dimmer than before. And then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the creaking floorboards. Pete swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught only empty space. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right next to him. And then the whisper came, "You should have helped me." Pete turned, and there, standing in the dim light of the flashlight, was Tim. His face was pale, his clothes singed and torn, and his eyes, those same hollow, black eyes, bored into Pete's soul. "You should have helped me," Tim repeated, his voice rising. The bar began to shake, bottles falling from shelves, chairs toppling over, the air thick with the smell of smoke and ash. Pete screamed, dropping the flashlight as he scrambled toward the door. But it wouldn't open. No matter how hard he pulled, the door refused to budge. Tim's figure loomed closer, his voice now a deafening roar. "You left me to die." Pete fell to his knees, covering his ears, as the room filled with the sound of crackling flames and shattering glass. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on. The bar was silent, and Tim was gone. When the sun rose the next morning, the owner found Pete slumped against the door, clutching the photograph of Tim. He was alive but shaken, unable to speak about what had happened. He left town shortly after and never returned. The Golden Lantern remains open to this day, but the regulars tell new bartenders to watch the mirrors late at night and to always lock the doors at closing time. Because sometimes, if you're not careful, you might see Tim staring back at you. It was a quiet Thursday night at the Rusty Nail, a bar tucked away in the heart of the city. The kind of place where the regulars knew each other by name and the bartenders knew their drinks before they even ordered. That night, the bar was nearly empty, save for a couple of patrons nursing their drinks and the bartender, Lisa, wiping down the counter. The dull hum of the TV in the corner was the only sound filling the room when the stranger walked in. He was tall, with a lean frame and an aura that seemed to fill the room the moment he stepped inside. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a hat, and his long coat trailed behind him as he approached the bar. Lisa greeted him with the practiced cheer of someone used to late-night visitors. "What'll it be?" she asked, setting down her rag. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Something strong," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Lisa poured him a whiskey, sliding the glass across the counter. He didn't touch it right away, instead running his fingers along the rim of the glass as if deep in thought. Then, without warning, he spoke again. "Do you believe in the devil?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Excuse me?" "The devil," the man repeated, finally lifting the glass to his lips. "Do you believe he walks among us?" The question hung in the air, an unexpected chill settling over the room. Lisa laughed nervously, unsure whether the man was joking or simply strange. "I'm not sure," she replied, pouring herself a glass of water. "But I've seen my fair share of devils in here." The man chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "You think the devil wears horns and a tail?" he asked. "No, the real devils. They look like you and me." He set the glass down and leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me tell you a story." Lisa hesitated, but something in his tone compelled her to listen. He began to recount the tale of a man who, years ago, had come into a bar much like this one. He was charming, unassuming, and friendly to everyone he met. But behind his smile, he hid a darkness, a secret life of lies, betrayal, and worse. "He used to sit right there," the man said, pointing to a seat at the far end of the bar. "That's where he'd meet his victims." Lisa felt a shiver run down her spine. "Victims?" she asked. The man nodded. He was a predator, knew how to lure people in, gain their trust, and then take everything from them. Their money, their dignity, their lives. Lisa glanced nervously at the seat the man had pointed to, half expecting to see someone sitting there. "What happened to him?" she asked. The man's smile faded. "One night, someone figured him out, followed him into the alley behind the bar. And let's just say, he didn't make it home." Lisa tried to shake off the unease creeping over her. "That's quite a story," she said, forcing a smile. The man raised an eyebrow. "You don't believe me?" "I didn't say that," Lisa replied quickly. The man leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Then maybe you'll believe this." He launched into another tale, this one more unsettling than the last. It was about a woman who frequented a bar after losing her husband in a tragic accident. She was kind, quiet, and unassuming, but she carried a burden, a guilt that gnawed at her every day. "You see," the man said, his voice dropping lower, "the accident wasn't really an accident. Lisa's breath caught. What do you mean? The man smiled faintly, as if enjoying her discomfort. She killed him, not with her hands, but with her lies. She told him things that weren't true, drove him to a place where he couldn't take it anymore. And then one night, he drove his car off a bridge. Lisa felt her stomach turn. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into his glass, his expression unreadable. Because, he said finally, sometimes the people we think are victims aren't. By now, Lisa was visibly shaken. The man's stories weren't just unsettling. They felt personal, almost as if he was speaking directly to her. She glanced at the clock, hoping her shift would end soon. But the man wasn't finished. One last story, he said, setting his empty glass on the counter. Lisa hesitated but nodded. There was a bartender, he began, his voice soft but cutting. She was good at her job, always smiling, always listening. But she had a secret too. She'd seen something she shouldn't have one night. Something terrible. And instead of speaking up, she stayed quiet. Lisa's heart raced. Why? The man leaned forward, his eyes piercing hers. Because she was scared. Scared of what would happen if she told the truth. Scared of who might come for her. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And do you know what happened to her? Lisa shook her head, her throat dry. The man smiled, a cold, humorless smile. She's still here, waiting, watching, wondering if tonight will be the night she finally tells someone what she saw. Lisa froze, her mind racing. The man's words felt like a direct accusation, as if he knew something about her that she hadn't shared. But before she could respond, he stood up, placing a crumpled bill on the counter. Thanks for the drink, he said, tipping his hat. And just like that, he was gone. It started with a rumor, a story whispered among the city's night owls, passed along in half-drunken conversations in dimly lit bars. There was a place, they said, hidden beneath the streets, accessible only to those who knew where to look. It wasn't listed on any map, and no amount of searching online would reveal its location. The only way in was through an invitation, whispered into the ear of those deemed worthy. For Jackson, a freelance photographer with a penchant for chasing the unusual, the invitation came from a man he barely remembered meeting. It was late one night, and Jackson was at a bar downtown, nursing his drink and flipping through his camera roll when the man approached. "You look like someone who appreciates a good story," the man said, sliding onto the stool beside him. Jackson glanced up, startled by the stranger's sudden presence. The man was older, with graying hair and a sharp suit that seemed out of place in the rundown bar. "I guess," Jackson replied cautiously. The man smiled, leaning closer. "There's a place you should see, a bar unlike any other, but it's not for everyone." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "What's so special about it?" "It's not the kind of place you go to forget," the man said cryptically. "It's the kind of place you go to remember." Before Jackson could respond, the man slid a small card across the counter. It was black, with an address printed in faint silver letters. No name, no phone number, just the address and a single word beneath it: midnight. When Jackson looked up, the man was gone. Curiosity had always been Jackson's greatest weakness. He spent the next day debating whether to go to the address on the card, telling himself it was probably nothing, a gimmick, a private party, or some underground dive bar trying too hard to be exclusive. But as midnight approached, he found himself standing outside the address, a nondescript building in a deserted alleyway. The building's facade was unremarkable, gray brick with no signage, no windows, and a single black door. Jackson hesitated, the weight of uncertainty pressing against him. But before he could turn back, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her face partially obscured by shadows. She was dressed in black, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "Jackson?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. He nodded, surprised. "How did you—" "Follow me," she interrupted, stepping aside to let him in. The interior was as unremarkable as the exterior. Bare walls, dim lighting, and a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The woman didn't wait for him to ask questions. disappearing down the stairs without a backward glance. Jackson hesitated only briefly before following, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The staircase seemed endless, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, heavier, and the faint hum of distant music began to reach his ears. When they finally reached the bottom, Jackson found himself standing in a long, dimly lit hallway. At the far end was another door, this one made of heavy wood with ornate carvings that seemed to twist and shift in the flickering light. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Once you go in, there's no turning back," she said. Jackson swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. But he was already here, and curiosity had already won. He nodded, and the woman pushed the door open. Beyond the door was a bar unlike anything Jackson had ever seen. The room was cavernous, its walls carved from ancient stone that seemed to pulse faintly with an unnatural light. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into darkness, and the air was filled with the low hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. The patrons were as strange as the setting. They sat in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their faces half hidden in shadows. Some were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, as if they'd stepped out of another century. Others looked perfectly normal, business suits, casual wear, but their eyes told a different story. At the center of the room was the bar itself, a long counter made of polished black stone that seemed to absorb the light. Behind it stood the bartender, a tall, imposing figure with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, as he poured drinks and slid them across the counter without a word. Jackson approached cautiously, sliding onto one of the tall stools. The bartender looked up, his gaze locking onto Jackson's with an intensity that made him shiver. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I'm not sure," Jackson admitted. The bartender smirked faintly, reaching for a bottle of dark liquid. He poured it into a glass and set it in front of Jackson. "On the house," he said. Jackson hesitated, the glass cold against his fingers. The liquid inside was thick and almost black, with faint wisps of smoke curling off the surface. He took a cautious sip, the taste unlike anything he'd ever experienced, sweet and bitter, warm and cold, comforting and terrifying all at once. "First time?" a voice asked from beside him. Jackson turned to see a man seated at the bar, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. He smiled faintly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Yeah," Jackson admitted. "What is this place?" The man chuckled. "The last stop," he said cryptically, as Jackson sat at the bar, listening to the cryptic remarks of the other patrons. He began to notice strange details about the room. The walls weren't just stone. They were engraved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked directly at them. The drinks being served were unlike anything he'd seen before, glowing faintly or swirling with colors that seemed impossible. And the patrons, they weren't entirely human. One man's hands seemed to flicker between flesh and bone. A woman at the far end of the bar had eyes that reflected light like a predator's. Jackson's unease grew with each passing moment. But before he could leave, the bartender spoke again. "The bar chooses who can enter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And it chooses who can leave." Jackson's heart sank. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The bartender didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to the far corner of the room, where a door stood ajar. "You'll find your answer in there," he said. Jackson hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But something compelled him to move forward, his feet carrying him toward the door as if they had a will of their own. Beyond the door was a small room, its walls lined with photographs. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the images. They were of people, smiling, laughing, raising glasses in celebration. But as he looked closer, he recognized some of the faces. They were the patrons of the bar, and the dates on the photographs were decades, even centuries old. At the center of the room was a single empty frame, its polished surface reflecting Jackson's wide-eyed expression. Beneath it was a small plaque with a name etched into the metal, Jackson Carter. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, as the door slammed shut behind him. Jackson stood frozen, his reflection in the empty frame staring back at him with wide, panicked eyes. The room seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The faint hum of the bar beyond the door was now muffled, as if he had been sealed in a separate reality. He turned, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" he shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response. Instead, the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, casting the room in a flickering, otherworldly light. Jackson's breath came in short gasps as the photographs around him seemed to shift. The faces in the images, once joyful, now looked at him with hollow, accusing eyes. Their expressions twisted, their smiles turned to grimaces. And then he heard the voice. "You wanted to know the truth." Jackson spun around, but the room was empty. The voice came again, deep and resonant, reverberating through his very bones. "This is where it ends? For all of us?" Before Jackson could respond, the door behind him creaked open. He turned slowly, hesitating before stepping back into the bar. But the room he entered was no longer the same. The patrons were gone. The bar counter stood empty, the black stone now cracked and dull. The faint glow that had lit the space was extinguished, leaving only the dim light of flickering candles scattered across the room. And at the center of it all stood the bartender, his piercing eyes locked onto Jackson. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the bartender asked, his tone mocking. Jackson shook his head, his voice trembling. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The bartender smirked, stepping closer. "This isn't a bar," he said. "It's a ledger, a record of those who've come before you, of those who've made the same mistake." "Mistake?" Jackson asked, backing away. The bartender tilted his head. "You stepped through the door. You accepted the invitation. And now, you belong to us." Jackson's heart pounded as he backed away, his mind racing for a way out. But every path seemed to close around him, the walls pressing in, the air thick with despair. The bartender stepped closer, his figure growing taller, more imposing, as if feeding on Jackson's fear. "There has to be a way out," Jackson said, more to himself than anyone else. The bartender's smile widened. "You're welcome to try," he said, gesturing toward the staircase that led back to the surface. Jackson didn't wait for another word. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He reached the stairs and began to climb, his legs burning with effort. But no matter how far he went, the top of the staircase never seemed to come closer. The walls began to shift, the steps beneath his feet crumbling and reforming. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, whispering his name, their voices growing louder and more insistent. "You can't leave," they said, their tone almost mocking. "You belong to the bar now." Jackson stumbled, falling to his knees. He looked up and saw the bartender standing at the top of the staircase, his face illuminated by an unholy light. "You see," the bartender said, his voice calm and unyielding, "this isn't a place you leave. It's a place you become." Jackson's strength failed him. He collapsed onto the stairs, his breath ragged, his vision blurring. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out every other sound. And then silence. He opened his eyes to find himself back in the small room with the photographs. But this time, the empty frame at the center was no longer empty. It held his image, frozen in terror, his eyes wide and pleading. Beneath it, the plaque now bore a new engraving. Jackson Carter, 2025. The bartender's voice echoed through the room one last time. "Welcome to the bar beneath the city." And then the door closed.